events and activities that the Middle East Institute is going to be putting on this year. And all of us down on the second floor are very happy to see such a large turnout. We organized this seminar on rather short notice, but I felt that even though I had just arrived in Singapore in the last few days, that on the occasion of the anniversary of 9/11, we would be remiss, really, if we didn't at least gather together some of our friends and colleagues for a discussion of where we are at this point. The Middle East Institute, for those of you that are perhaps not familiar with it, is a very new institute here, and it is my understanding that I have a mandate to help enlarge it and develop it. And with the help of a number of colleagues whom I've already been talking to, I'm optimistic that we will be able to broaden the research output of this institute and to cover not only the traditional areas of policy research and security studies and so forth, which I think is high on the agenda of most folks in Singapore, but also for a deeper and more, a richer kind of comprehension of our complicated but troubled region. We're hoping that we'll be able to bring in specialists who work on the political economy of the region, on society and culture. There are a number of issues on the arts and so forth that I think would broaden our collective understanding of a region that in our geography extends from the Mediterranean across North Africa, all of the Arab world, across the traditional Near East. And without wishing to get into jurisdictional disputes, I found that after many years, I'm now on leave from Georgetown from the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, that our definition of the Arab world also turned out to be quite elastic. And especially since the events of 9/11, with the phenomenon of what we sometimes call networked Islamist extremism, defying the usual geographic categories, we discovered that we needed to try and get up to speed on areas that we really did not have the kind of deep expertise that we would have liked to. That means, of course, the larger region extending eastward to Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so forth. One of the new acronyms in Washington, an infelicitous one, is AFPAC, because policymakers and think tank people in Washington are sort of trying to conceive of our latest embroilment in the subcontinent in somewhat different terms that don't follow the usual conventional borders. So having said that, I would like to introduce our panel and what we will do today. There are four of us, a gang of four, and we're going to, we thought we would, in a very straightforward way, each of us would offer some remarks on different dimensions of the post 9/11 situation. And then, of course, we'll throw open the discussion and we'll welcome your comments as well. And I believe we're scheduled to adjourn by 5:30? 6? Okay, good. All right, well, having said that, let me just introduce my colleagues, and then we will start. I'm going to talk about the sort of American dimension, since that's where I have just come from. And I have asked my colleagues in the Institute to lend their expertise. And so Dr. Rahman, who's been a visiting fellow with us, is going to speak to the Islamic dimension. Dr. Rahman is a visiting senior research fellow at MEI, and he has had quite a long and varied career, having worked as a senior fellow with the Japan Foundation. He's completed a research project on politics and reform in Japan, but he really comes from Bangladesh, and he's a distinguished professor from Dhaka University. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago, which is a very excellent place to get a PhD from. And he, among other things, he has taught at the United Nations University Leadership Academy in Jordan. He spent some time in Washington, at George Washington University and other places. He's been awarded a number of fellowships and so forth. And he is he's going to be giving a couple of formal lectures in our series within the next couple of months, so we will hear more from him. And then I'm pleased to introduce a colleague whom I just met from NTU. He was kind enough to come over, again on rather short notice, to talk about the terrorism dimension. So Ustaz Mohammed Faisal is a senior analyst at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism in RSIS at NTU. And his specialized area is counter-ideology and rehabilitation of terrorists. He has visited rehab centers in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Indonesia, and prisons in Thailand and the Philippines. So I think he has quite an interesting body of experience to draw on. He is also a religious counselor from the Religious Rehabilitation Group in Singapore, where he has counseled Jama'ah al-Islamiyya detainees. So we're going to get a kind of a perspective from this field, which is a little bit different from the traditional fields of Middle East studies. And then, finally, to wind up, our own colleague, Ambassador Minase Matthews, who is the Deputy Director of MEI. He is the non-resident ambassador to Bangladesh. He has had a great deal of experience here in Southeast Asia, both as a diplomat and an observer. He writes, I understand, occasional op-ed pieces, and we thought that it would be only fitting, since the phenomenon of networked Islamist extremism extends to Southeast Asia, as well as many other places, that he would comment on the Southeast Asian dimension. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to start, and then we'll follow with the Islamic, or the terroristic, and the Southeast Asian dimensions. So let me begin by asking, to use the famous phrase that was attributed to George W. Bush, although he did not actually utter the words, mission accomplished? After 9 years, can we say that the problem of 9/11 has been solved? This is actually not such an easy question to answer, and I know coming very recently from Washington, there's a surprising amount of debate, quite a lot of ambiguity on the part of observers and officials as to whether we really did solve the problem by declaring, as President Bush famously did, the global war on terror. Now, the most important thing to note, which is perhaps the most obvious, is that there have been no major attacks on the scale of 9/11 in the United States since then. So one might say that by default, at least conceivably, what the U.S. government did might have prevented something else like 9/11, although it's, of course, very difficult to know whether the fact that there have been no further 9/11s, whether that's due to our policies or whether it is due to any number of other factors. Let me review with you the initial responses on the American side to the bombings of the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the airplane that came down over Pennsylvania in September 2001. It seems to me in the immediate aftermath, the U.S. faced a real turning point, a real choice. You could have treated this as a police action, amenable to handling according to police methods, detective work, cooperative action on the part of law enforcement agencies, treating it essentially as a monstrous crime rather than a declaration of war on us. And I remember very well at a meeting of the Middle East Studies Association that took place in November, just a couple of months later. I was on a panel. It was a very big session, and there was a huge debate. This was among academics who said, you know, maybe what we're doing is not the right thing. Maybe we shouldn't be declaring a global war on terror. Maybe we shouldn't be invading Afghanistan to rid that place of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Maybe we are making a kind of a strategic mistake. Clearly that was a minority view, and the American public, I think quite understandably, felt that a robust, exceptional kind of response was necessary, and that's clearly, of course, what President Bush undertook. So we chose to go to war rather than treat this as a big crime. And what we did, of course, I think everybody knows, but 9 years later, I think many people in the United States, at least, are having second thoughts about some of the major activities that the U.S. undertook, starting, of course, with the invasion of Afghanistan itself. It certainly seemed necessary and proper at the time, and it looked, I think, to most people that, you know, we were attacked. The attack came from there. We were accustomed to thinking in sort of classical Westphalian terms of a world of nations and balances of power and conflict and so forth as constructed in terms of nation states, and there was this nation state, as it were, or at least a state, or at least a country called Afghanistan, and we had to do something about it. So we did. We got rid of the Taliban, but we didn't get bin Laden, and I think it's a source of considerable political embarrassment to the United States that the guy got away and that he is still at large somewhere. And so this is, I think, a really serious sign that we were not by any means entirely successful. And then, of course, as time went on, we thought we had sort of settled things in Afghanistan. We kind of drew back, and then lo and behold, by 2005, the Taliban were coming back, and they are coming back, as we all know. The statistics are quite alarming, and I think the American policymakers are now probably realize that if Iraq was a problem that we could have avoided, Afghanistan is an even bigger problem, and at the moment we are not very close to a happy ending to this one. So we did that. But in the meantime, Al-Qaeda, that elusive Al-Qaeda or its spin-offs, seemed to have largely migrated to other places. Where they are, of course, is a matter that all of our dozens and dozens of security and intelligence agencies have not fully been able to pin down. But it appears, I think there's a consensus among analysts in Washington that there are not all that many of them in Afghanistan. So if the whole point, essentially, of going in there was to deal Al-Qaeda, a fatal blow. It seems as if they more or less got away. Badly wounded, to be sure, but they did get away. So that was Afghanistan. But that wasn't enough, and the neoconservatives, who in a sense, in my opinion, kind of hijacked American policy, decided that Iraq needed, for all kinds of reasons, some public, some private, needed to have a regime change. And so we went into Iraq in 2003. We are still there, and we probably will be there, despite the recent decisions to withdraw what we call combat units from that country. It is often said in the States that Afghanistan was a war of necessity. More people think Iraq was a war of choice, and the fact that it was a bad choice, it was not necessary to do this. It proved that Saddam Hussein not only wasn't harboring Al-Qaeda types or Salafist organizations, but he seemed actually to be as much opposed to them as we were. And so the motivation, the primary motivation that emerged in the public discourse, namely the question of ridding the region of weapons of mass destruction, that also proved elusive. And as some analysts have noted, whatever the outcome in Iraq, we can declare victory, although you will have noticed that Obama's statement on the occasion of announcing the withdrawal of combat brigades was very muted. He was not certainly saying mission accomplished. He was playing it down, and I think for a man who had campaigned on the idea of getting America out of Iraq, he has yielded some political benefits from this decision gradually to pull out. But it is not a huge political blockbuster in the American political arena. In fact, it's interesting that Iraq does not really figure very prominently on the list of issues that the American electorate is concerned about as we approach the November elections. Well, so that was that. We lost 4,400 soldiers, upwards of 30,000 seriously wounded, and the count of Iraqis who died in the course of this operation and the insurgencies and counterinsurgencies that followed is, I think, anybody's guess, but it surely is more than 100,000, and that's a sobering figure to contemplate. All the more so because when you look at the Iraq adventure, an adventure in regime change and democratization on sort of the ideological level of the neoconservatives, there was one unintended side effect that rankles the strategic thinkers in the West even today, and that is the fact that Iran emerged as a relatively big winner here. So all the effort that had been expanded by, not just by the United States, but it came to dominate the Gulf, but the British before and so forth, to protect the vulnerable Arab oil kingdoms from the two big guys at the top of the Gulf, Iraq and Iran, by balancing one off against the other, sort of went down the drain because the course of doing regime change in Iraq gave Iran an opening which it will continue to exploit for a long time. And inasmuch as Iran is now seen as posing a kind of a polar ideological threat to the way Washington views its interests in the region, this is a serious liability. But then there was the ideological battle that was going on that the Bush administration resorted to try and explain why it's doing what it's doing, arguing, interestingly, that the roots of terrorism, the roots of extremism, the roots of Al-Qaeda lie in the bad government that's going on in the region. And the conclusion that was drawn was that if you could just provide them with good government, democratic government, you would be doing a lot to rid the world of this scourge of terrorist extremism. So Iraq, in a sense, was perhaps the poster child for this kind of a policy. American officials in the first Bush administration, the second Bush administration got a dose of realism, but the first Bush administration, I think, was ideologically quite enthusiastic, thinking that America, as the primary power in the world, could pretty much reshape this troubled region in a way that would reduce the threat of terrorism, but with muscular regime change by military means in Iraq, the threat of doing it in Iran, the potentiality of doing it in Syria, and so forth, turned out to have more negative than positive consequences. And so by the time the Obama administration came to power, a liberal democratic administration that you would think would be more amenable to the idea of liberal reform and harmony and so forth, the Obama administration found that there had been a kind of a weird reversal of ideologies. The Bush neocons had appropriated the liberals' sort of democratic mantle, and Obama is now left as the practitioner of realpolitik, which I suspect he didn't really want to be. So, the ideological battle then was formulated in the U.S. as regime change by force if necessary, and democratization in order to drain the swamp of terrorist extremism. But in the process of doing all this, the U.S. suffered a considerable loss of prestige and credibility throughout the region. Even governments, even Arab governments that are largely friends or clients of the United States were nervous, to say the least, about this muscular American approach, because I think some of them began to wonder, well, if they really believe in democratization for Iraq, Iran, and Syria, maybe they believe in it for Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt. In any case, our governmental friends were nervous, and I think public opinion in the region, certainly in the Arab part of the Middle East, was outright hostile to what the Americans were doing. We were really pushy, and the specter of past sort of colonial arrogance began to be reignited and applied to the United States. So, we come now to Obama. And Obama, let us be fair, Obama has so many problems. He has real challenges. But he ran and was elected partly to clean up the mess of the Middle East that had been left by George W. Bush. And he started off in a rather promising way. Certainly people thought in the initial months of his administration that he might actually recalibrate U.S. policy on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And more importantly, or in a more spectacular way, Obama made a very eloquent speech at Cairo University in June of 2009. It was Outreach to the Muslim World by Barack Hussein Obama. And the poll numbers, as I recall, which were in single digits, we were so unpopular throughout most of the region, began to lift up a little bit. There was a lot of hope, I think, generated certainly among many liberal intellectuals in the Arab world that the United States had kind of seen the light and pulled in its horns a little bit. However, the problems persisted. Obama had this unending problem of finishing Iraq, getting out of Iraq, but hopefully leaving Iraq as a place where Al-Qaeda or some variation of it wouldn't come back if the country were to devolve into another spasm of chaos, which I think is actually still quite possible. That's a problem. At the same time, Afghanistan was getting worse, and the Obama people ended up being quite as tough as the Bush people had been when it came to matters of terrorism, counterterrorism. So we had a backtracking on closing of Guantanamo. We had a continuation of very tough measures against enemy combatants that continue to alarm civil rights groups in the United States. And we had, perhaps most dramatically, the dramatically increased use of Predator unmanned aircraft to target, to kill suspected Taliban or Al-Qaeda figures in Afghanistan and Pakistan and some other places. This happens in Yemen, I think. It's happened in Yemen. So, in a way, the Obama administration, contrary to what a lot of people thought, was actually showing its teeth and continues to do so as we wrestle with a region that I think inadvertently we have made more turbulent and unstable in our quest to avenge the crime of 9/11. So where might we conclude 9 years later on all of this? My own view is, this is not perhaps a popular view in the United States, but if we had to do it all over again, maybe police work would have been better than the global war on terrorism strategy. We've seen that Al-Qaeda as an organization was severely decimated, but it also metastasized into other, what I think our terrorism colleagues call franchises, like McDonald's, here and there and everywhere. And it seemed also to spawn wannabes, individuals or small groups without any known connection to any of these famous organizations who just decided to go and do something. And we've had a couple of rather serious incidents in the United States where individuals have just gone off and killed soldiers or tried to blow up airplanes and so forth. So, there we are. Networked extremism is our #1 national security threat, according to Obama, but defining the enemy is still a problem. It is networked, non-territorial, it's really hard to pin it down. And when you get to an outfit like the Taliban, you now begin to think, well, maybe there are bad Taliban and good Taliban, extremists and moderates within. Do you negotiate? How far do you go without kind of losing the game altogether? And finally, let me make just 2 points. And I will turn to my little computer here, if Fran will help me. There has been a staggering growth in the national security apparatus of the United States. And a recent, I think quite brilliant series of investigative articles in the Washington Post, which some of you may have seen, illustrated the nature of the expansion of the security apparatus in the U.S. to such a point that the authors of the piece argued that we have really overdone it. We have spent without limit. There has been little control on which organization does what. Masses of information, often duplicated information, have been accumulated, but so it's hard actually to keep track of what might be real intelligence. So as you can see from the pie chart here, there are some 45 government organizations in what the authors of this piece called top secret America. And this is just a list of them that you can scan to give you a sense of the bureaucratic response to 9/11. It has been quite overwhelming, from something called the Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization, all the way down to Customs and Border Protection, Secret Service, and so on. And here are the numbers that the Washington Post investigative team came up with. 854,000 workers holding top secret security clearances. Over 1,000 government organizations working on counterterrorism, etc. Nearly 2,000 private companies working on this. 4,000 corporate offices around Washington handling classified information, and 50,000 intelligence reports published each year by analysts. Can you imagine trying to process all this stuff? Every day at the National Counterterrorism Center, they found 5,000 pieces of terrorist-related data were reviewed. Well, okay. Now, let me give you a summary of this with the, we have a little video link from these same people. How do I do this? Escape and, yes. This is about a 2-minute summary by the people who did the report. Well, at any rate, the video was rather dramatic. Here we go.
You think you know America, but you don't know top secret America.
Top secret America. I guess, well, that's because it's secret.
Somebody doesn't want us to know.
I guess somebody in the National Security Agency probably blocked us. At any rate, maybe we can switch to the last slides. It looks like we will not be able to see this. Yes. The last point I wanted to make has to do with a very disturbing recent development, and this is the sort of resurgence of anti-Islamic feeling in the United States. You probably have been following the enormously bitter and divisive conflict over building an Islamic cultural center in New York City, a few blocks away from the site of the old World Trade Center buildings. This is a Pandora's box. This was a project that passed all of New York City's administrative requirements. It was not a secret, but it was picked upon by political aspirants who saw the opportunity to make a point, and they fed the understandably raw feelings of the survivors of the nearly 3,000 people that were killed in the 9/11 attacks. And so we've had a renewal of the kind of anti-Muslim feeling that surfaced immediately after the attacks of 2001. One of my Muslim friends, a colleague of mine at Georgetown, Tunisian, a security expert actually, moderate fellow, said that he feels hounded, he feels more threatened than in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And unfortunately, it's not just in New York City that you've seen evidence of this resurgence of anti-Islamic feeling. A number of other places around the country, in Florida, in Tennessee, Michigan, there have been increased incidents of anti-Islamic hate activities. And as you can see here from a recent poll, we are looking at a growth in the unfavorable opinions toward Islam held by Americans. So in January 2002, which was only a few months after 9/11, it was peaking in around 24%. But look at what it is now. It is pushing 50%. That's quite disturbing. And there is a real worry, I think, on the part of our officials that these manifestations are going to play out. There's going to be reactions to this, just as there were after the Danish cartoons and so forth. And even though this self-described clergyman down in Florida, with a congregation of all of fewer than 100 people, declared he was going to have a Quran burning festival yesterday, he withdrew from that. But in the sense that damage has already been done, and I can easily understand why President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have expressed so much concern about what has happened. So there's, as you can see, there's pretty overwhelming opinion in the United States that this Islamic Center should not be built. And the main reason for that is it is location, that it's too close to the site, as if, as it's portrayed, a sacred site, and the idea of having something Islamic near it is, as they put it, insensitive. What that really masks, I think, is basically a highly discriminatory attitude, guilt by implication, if you will. And so here we are, and I think that at that point we have to close on a rather somber note. We haven't finished with this problem, and in some ways the people that did 9/11 and in the writings of Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri, you see indications that they want to incite anti-Muslim feeling. They want a clash of civilizations, and here we are 9 years later, and it's still a very real danger. And so with that, I will stop because we have actually a specialist on Islamic matters who will have his own perspective. So I turn it to Professor Rahman.
Thank you very much, Professor Hudson, Chair, and my colleagues and distinguished participants. I think I would like to take the cue where Professor Hudson stopped. I think I would begin and end up where he started. So I will reverse the process, and I would like to, in the beginning, I just want to say that 9/11 was indeed a kind of apocalyptic atrocity. There is no doubt about it. And while the attack itself was of such magnitude and such unprecedented event that it was it shocked the whole world, no doubt about it. But what came in the wake of it is more devastating for the Muslim world. So I just want to focus on some of the challenges that came in the wake of that event and which continue till today. And maybe we have to cope with it maybe next, I don't know, another generation or so. So this is the challenge which I would like to say. And I would like to focus on the fallouts of 9/11 or impacts on at three levels. One is, as Professor Hudson finished, on the religion itself, Islam. Because the group which perpetrated this heinous act belonged to Islamic faith, at least in name. So questions emerged immediately about the nature of Islam, its precept and teaching, and its compatibility with liberal democratic values and processes. And in fact, over the years, many philosophical, political, and psychological issues had to be addressed and explained. The people in the West wanted to comprehend whether there was anything inherent or intrinsic in this religion that incites violence and terrorism. And the Islamophobia was also reinforced by the neoconservatives in the West. So I think the confluence of the two things. But it was also clear that many people genuinely were curious about some of the concepts, intellectual foundation of Islam, and some of the concepts like jihad, and the extent of tolerance and compassion that is encouraged by this great religion, by its scripts, Quran and Hadith. So that was one intellectual challenge which I thought the Islamic world had to cope with immediately after 9/11 and which continued. Second is, even if theoretically one could explain, the manifestation of Islam came in the wake of, came over the years in such a way, like if you look at the conservative face of Islam in the form of Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the highly conservative nature of Islam. And then we have also revolutionary and theocratic Islam in Iran. And third, we have the terrorist face in the name of Islam by a non-state actor widely known as Al-Qaeda. So I think intellectual discussions in the Islamic countries began to change, to take this challenge of interpretation of Islam in new light, and over the years since 9/11. And so many think tanks, universities concentrated on new ways of understanding Islam and how to relate to the Western world. If you look at some of the Islamic universities and institutes in the Middle East and North Africa, South and Southeast Asia. So there are efforts to engage in debates and finding answers to some of these things. And second, I think at individual level, 9/11 shattered communication barriers inside and outside the Islamic world. As there is a lot of discussion about the West's attitude towards the Islamic world, towards Islam itself, US foreign policy, and how best to deal with the Western knowledge and perceptions about Islam. More and more people were asking questions in the Islamic world about democracy and its compatibility with Islam, about the US role in the Islamic world and what is in store in the future. So the intellectual discourse on Islam took also a political dimension at various levels, that Islam theoretically takes a very integrated view of religion and politics. So that was also another misunderstanding and which had to be reconciled. Second, very quickly, I just want to put the framework, is fallout on Muslims as community, like Muslim people, 9/11 was indeed a cataclysmic event for Muslims who lived as communities in different parts of the world, constituting 1/4 of the humanity. The backlash of 9/11 Muslims in the West came immediately in the form of hate crimes, discrimination, and other indignities, and even continues today whenever terrorist acts occur. So Muslims perceived that they were fractured, marginalized, and languished because of 9/11, and the American war on global war on terror was really directed towards them as people and community. So that was the suspicion, and that's why there were a lot of suspicions and surveillance and harassment that they had to suffer. So not only in the West, but also in other parts of the world, including the Middle East and Muslim countries, where the governments of those countries joined the US global war on terror. So it was not only confined to the West. But paradoxically, the US war on terror also reinforced the sense of Muslim identity, amplifying perceptions of a clash between the West and the Islamic world. Some groups of Muslims were radicalized, while others distanced themselves from the terror. But the war on terror, and particularly the invasion of Iraq in the wake of 9/11, led to a very negative image of the United States in the Islamic world. The Iraqi people suffered tremendously and paid the heaviest cost for 9/11. Although Iraq's Al-Qaeda links has not yet been found, or the 9/11 Commission even could not find that Iraq was involved with the 9/11 event. So the key words are the alienation and frustration, which ran high among the Muslim communities for a long time, leading to radicalization among young people in some countries. In fact, the current radicalization in the Middle East states, and especially Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Palestine territory, drew on some structural factors, or reinforced by some structural factors like economic deprivations, social marginalization, and so they resort to violence and terrorism in the name of Islam. So that was on the Muslim community. And third, I think the impact, which is very important, is the post-9/11 security and geopolitical order. As Professor Hudson was telling, yes, 9/11 was not merely an American tragedy. It was also a tragedy for millions of Muslims and the Muslim states who suffered as a result of the then American or Bush government's responses to the event. In fact, the political landscape in the Middle East had changed in some important ways. One, because of the United States invasion of Iraq changed, that led to deaths and destruction. So US also suffered many deaths and huge economic losses in this futile war. So Saddam Hussein is dead, but a stable democratic order in Iraq is yet to emerge. Divides and fragmentation of Iraqi people and the continued activities of the insurgents in the form of suicide bombings and terrorist attack cast a somber shadow on the future of Iraq. So that's one, I think, important element. The second is the Palestine-Israeli conflict. So this was relegated to the background because of the 9/11 impact. Peace process was inactive for many years and still inactive, and the security is frequently aggravated by Israeli air attacks and the Palestinian suicide bombings. The settlement issue is yet to be resolved. So I think the festering despair and agony that terrorism and hatred fed on continues and pose threat to peaceful coexistence of two peoples which is being eloquently echoed by George Bush, live side by side in peace as two states. So the recent window of hope created by President Obama, I think this new initiative of dialogue is a step in the right direction, but it is fraught with uncertainty and disruptive activities of the Hamas as well as other hard-line or Orthodox Jewish groups. So the chance is that the current efforts will not bear fruit so easily. Third, I think the mapping out of a future order in the Middle East for a viable peace is still difficult, with Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and other jihadist groups are still operating in the region with quote-unquote transnational linkages. So this, there are new insecurities created by these transnational insurgents groups or network extremist groups, which the Americans use, and particularly they're anchored in several theaters in the region: Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia, particularly vulnerable to this. Second is the ambivalent policy of the Middle East state is also partly responsible for the current security situation. Some of the powerful states of the region, including Saudi Arabia and Syria, were successful in combating terrorism in their territory, but still kept links with the jihadist groups. For example, while Syria distanced itself from Hezbollah, it still maintains strategic links with them for example, in Iraq, to have their advantage. Pakistan is another Muslim country which is threatened by the disruptive activities of the militant Islamic groups, including Al-Qaeda, but still kept connection with the jihadist or insurgent groups. Indonesia, the largest Muslim country, was a successful case in combating terrorism after the terrible Bali bombing in October 2002, but still faces Muslim backlash on any explosive issue that may occur, like the recent burning or threat of burning of Quran. So I think this issues is also combined with a kind of radicalization, as I mentioned, and has become a new phenomenon in many parts of the Islamic world. In fact, the concern for radicalization of social forces in the entire MENA region is real and has to be addressed in the coming days through structural, economic, and social reform to reduce vulnerability of the region to radical Islamic movements, already posing insecurities in Algeria, Sudan, and Morocco, and other Maghreb countries. And finally, the rise of Iran as a theocracy with nuclear ambition is another destabilizing factor in the Middle East. Iran has used oil, transnational Islamic and Shia identities, and underwent a revolutionary phase of transformation. In fact, how political leadership in Iran adapts to current pressures and security imperatives of the region will greatly determine the future geopolitical order of the Islamic world. In concluding, I would like to say that the Islamic world has learned many lessons from the 9/11 tragedy. It participated in the US global war on terror. It initiated new ways of relating to the Western world. In fact, both the Islamic world and the Western world realized, I hope, that anger, frustration, and extremist acts cannot legitimize grievances. Force, coercive diplomacy, sanctions, or politicization of religion cannot bring peace or greater national, regional, or global security. It is only through greater understanding of communities and nations, vigorous interactions, empathy and dialogue among religious, ethnic, or other groups that security can be assured on an enduring basis. Islam, for centuries, like other great religions, is a unique form of spirituality that preached and promoted the values of tolerance and cultural harmony in the area stretching from Morocco to Indonesia. It can also adapt itself to the new century as well, because by virtue of its inherent character, and Muslim people must work to that end. So the rise of media, satellite channels, liberal scholars, and educated younger generation are gradually transforming the environment in the Islamic world for greater understanding and reciprocity of interest between them and the Western world. We look forward to contributing to the deepening of that process in the future. So thank you.
Now we turn to Ustaz Muhammad Faisal for his take on this situation.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan, Mr. Rahman, Mr. Berger, for having me here. I will structure it in such a way that I will follow up from what both our distinguished speakers mentioned. And how I would like to do it is that first I will try to give a picture, an overview, sharing the evolution and resilience of terrorism itself today, post 9/11. And then we will look a little bit into the counter-terrorism responses within governments and communities in the world. And then we will conclude by looking at the challenges that we are facing today in terms of relating ourselves to the issue of terrorism. So my follow-up will be based on this understanding of how the Muslim world, Islam itself, was affected post 9/11, as been produced magnificently by Professor Rahman. But I will also focus that one major lesson that we learn in terrorism field is that of understanding what Al-Qaedaism is all about, as termed by Jason Burke, for example. First and foremost, the Muslim community itself, majority Muslim, understood that there is this variety. People, a minority within the Muslim community itself, who are pursuing an identity based on what we term Al-Qaedaism, founded by an ideology, a misconstrued understanding of an Islamic concept of what we call al-wala wal-bara, where it becomes certain from Al-Qaeda in the Middle East to Al-Qaeda and other networks in Southeast Asia, China, and other places that we have, where they based on this ideology of who our friends are, al-wala, and who our enemies should be, al-bara. So expanding on understanding the ideology of what Al-Qaeda is, what are the tools being made by Al-Qaeda to attract the hearts and minds of our younger generations to become part of their group, is one big factor that has attracted the youth, the Muslim community to be sympathizing to Al-Qaeda itself, and remains a resilient factor towards the evolution of terrorist groups in our world today. Now, number two, and further understanding of this resilience of terrorist groups are, as mentioned by Professor Rahman, the condition of the Muslim, the malaise faced by the Muslim Ummah after the post-September 11, where it was being made use of by such groups as Al-Qaeda and others to gain sympathy and support. I will only focus on one issue, the issue of the uniqueness of the structure of groups like Al-Qaeda, this network extremism that we are mentioning about. We see today, I'll just take example, for example, of Indonesia. We see Jemaah Islamiyah in Singapore has been curtailed in terms of its infrastructure. But what we see in Indonesia is the evolution of groups such as Jemaah Ansarut Tauhid and others, which have been based upon an ideology that was perpetuated by Darul Islam, Jemaah Islamiyah, and the rest. So this evolution, the ability of this network to continuously build upon a new image, yet bringing about such an ideology, is critical in understanding such evolution of terrorist groups. So multiplicity of groups, we can see of how they were able to network to Jemaah Islamiyah in Southeast Asia here with Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, another group. The role of Hambali with Al-Qaeda and other players. Khalid Sheikh Muhammad was in Manila at that particular time, September 11, and these contacts that he had, and this continues on to the next generation of JI family members. You can see now Abdul Rahim, the son of Abu Bakr Bashir, taking the lead on the roles of preaching this ideology of hatred and violence within our region, as an example. Number 3 is the issue of the dominance of the image of who speaks for Islam. So who is representing Islam in this global war on terror in that sense. So the minority Muslim community who are affected due to these grievances that they have felt in their countries, Pakistan, in Somalia, in other places, Philippines, within our region, see that there are not a particular individual that are representing their rights to exist. So the dominance of the image of Osama bin Laden, dominance of the image of Al-Zawahiri, the late Al-Zarqawi, and others. And for example, in our region here, Abu Bakr Bashir, there was a recent survey done in 2008 by University of Sydney to measure and look at the dominant voice of terrorism when it is being spoken about. Abu Bakr Bashir is number 1, ahead of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono himself when terrorism is spoken about. So this is the problem. Who speaks Islam, who represents Islam in terms of fighting against the elements of terrorism. Next feature of the evolution of terrorism you can see, as mentioned, in the issue of self-radicalized individuals. We have seen Omar Farouk, we have seen Major Nidal, we have seen in Singapore's case Muhammad Fadil, and others. This we see of the emergence of, in a way, quote and unquote, neutral, attractive ideologues who did not seem to connect themselves to a particular group, but existed with their own particular ideology of what Islam should be now. The figure like Anwar al-Awlaki and his cyber attractiveness in terms of how he projects with the English language, attracting these people to become, to be in the fold. So we see of the emergence of new ideologues perpetuating hatred and violence. Number 2 is the nature of youth in their search for truth. There seems to be a sense of loss for guidance. So the internet, the virtual reality, becomes the dominant factor, means for them to be attracted, to obtain an identity. So the failure to embrace due to this virtual reality, cyber world itself, they fail to embrace the dynamics of societies, of communities that they live in. And number 3, the issue of evolution of terrorism in the issue of prison radicalization. And this we have seen in many places of the world itself. We were to look at the recidivism rates from Gitmo to prisons in Saudi Arabia, to prisons in Yemen, to prisons in our region itself, we can see that there are continuous recidivists who have continuously perpetuated acts, suicide bombings and others after their release from prison itself. I'll just take one simple example. In Indonesia, because of the lack of the infrastructure of the prisons themselves, there was a warden in Bali in 2007 who himself was radicalized by the prisons. Number 2, the example of Aman Abdul Rahman, the leader of Jemaah Ansar Tauhid, where he was in prison in 2007, and in prison itself, he translated the whole works of Al-Maqdisi, and he was able to publish it while he was in prison. So this is the nature of the problem that we are facing in terms of prison radicalization. So looking at this spectrum of the evolution of terrorism, what we see next is responses, counter-terrorism responses from governments, communities, and others. We can see that the approach is from both two responses. Number 1 is the hard approach done by governments in terms of the issue of sharing of intelligence, the issue of policing, the issue of disrupt, catch, and kill, the issue of curtailing the infrastructure, the networks, the groups themselves. Number two, we see the issue of the soft approach, and this is gaining weight today, the issue of rehabilitation. We have been to places like Saudi Arabia, where they have had currently about 320 beneficiaries of this program, who are currently in their counseling, what they call Muhammad Ibn Naif Center for Counseling and Care. So about 120 beneficiaries of that particular center is from Gitmo, being released from Gitmo and have entered the center, and about 180 are those who are from local prisons of Saudi itself. So rehabilitation is taking steps. Saudi Arabia itself is taking another initiative, understanding the problem in terms of creating chairs and centers in King Saud University, in Imam Saud University. The establishing of the Prince Naif Chair of Intellectual Security in King Saud University itself is an example of the ability of the government to already see the need to research to understand what causes, what are the roots of this problem, and what are the policy-related initiatives that need to be done. We see places like Yemen having a program since 2003, headed by a minister currently who founded the rehabilitation program, but now has been made a minister in religious affairs, Minister Al-Hittar. He himself has grouped together all the religious scholars within the spectrum of the Yemeni religious community to come together to have dialogues with the detainees in their prisons and continuously engage these prisoners and their family members who have been caught in this magnitude of radicalization and terrorism. I have some friends here also from ICT Vidya, Mr. Salim, Jolin, Nazima, who have visited centers such as Libya, Camp Copper, Camp Buka, Iraq, and other places where such programs are in place, looking at rehabilitation initiative. Libya just recently, 2 weeks ago, released another 37 detainees. So they have released about 300 detainees from a total of 400 detainees that were members of the Libyan Islamic Federation Group, LIFG, headed by Norman bin Norman. So these are programs that are in place. Singapore itself, we have a program that works together between the intelligence and the religious community to rehabilitate. Another issue is the issue of reintegration. What happens next after their release from prison? This is to disrupt this amount of recidivism. So this itself is a work in progress, understanding the needs of the family and understanding how to curb vicious cycle among the detainees and those who have been in this field. So this whole aspect of the winning hearts and minds approach, understanding the need for soft approaches, are gaining weight in the momentum post-September 11 in challenging people being attracted into such groups and people who have been attracted into such groups being rehabilitated back, winning hearts and minds of their commitment back to understanding what Islam is all about. I will conclude in terms of what are the challenges that are being faced today in counter-terrorism. Number one is that we see many governments all around the world and communities too having a difficulty, this what we call the lack of political willingness. I've quoted the example of Yemen. The problem with Yemen today is currently the inability to continue rehabilitation, for example, due to political factions in the government itself that did not agree to the continuous process of winning hearts and minds of these detainees. The infiltration of Islamist political parties in certain governments that see that Al-Qaedaism is not a problem is another factor in terms of such approaches. Number two is the issue of identifying who speaks for Islam, who are the guidance for Muslims to understand the text of the Holy Book. I'll just take one example. In a recent conference held in a workshop held in Australia, where the government of Melbourne tried to get together all the religious imams represented within Melbourne itself. So there were imams from Turkey, imams from Somalia, imams from Egypt, imams from second generation imams, born Australian and others. The difficulty to get them to be united, to speak on a common ground, a united ground, in addressing the community that they face, based on this ethno nationalist understanding of how Islam should be practiced within their own particular communities, and building up commonality in terms of understanding Islam itself is a challenge. Number three, the issue of how do we develop better system to sustain existing programs, and at the same time to come up with new programs in countries that have not reacted well in terms of providing counter-terrorism narratives towards this problem. And on a final basis, I think the need for greater community engagement to minimize support and sympathizers to the cause of such groups, such ideologues, and such ideology. The works of the community itself in engaging the masses, and legal infrastructures in place. Indonesia is having a great problem in terms of how the court itself looks at the problem of continuously detaining those who are suspected terrorists, such as Abu Bakr al-Sheikh. And with that, I give an overview of the terrorism perspective post 9/11 and this name. Thank you.
Finally, my colleague, Ambassador Minase.
Thanks, man. I was wondering when you would give you the check. One doesn't have a check. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I've noted what the previous speakers said. You don't need to repeat it, but just let me say so that you'll get used to my voice. So the first thing is, first, he said that 9 years after the 9/11 attacks, there is no end in sight. The war on terrorism continues now. Two, that in Southeast Asia, at least from what you said, there are certain areas of success, especially in terms of rehabilitation. And that perhaps the worst part was 2001. I shall talk on something else very, very different. I noticed that Atul took over from Professor Hudson, you took over from him. I have nothing to take over. I will just instead go and make an unfair assumption. An unfair assumption that increasingly lots of people in this part of the world believe that 9/11 is an albatross around the neck of the American public, the American psyche. It is an albatross they don't appear to be able to get free. It is an albatross they are somehow unable to handle. And you ask yourself why, because this wouldn't have been the first time they had such a problem. It is not that there are no solutions. It is not that there are no sane people giving ideas, but somehow it is not happening. There are sane voices. On September 11th itself, a 30-year-old man in Chicago addressed the World Council of Churches, of Religions. And at the World Council of Religions, he got what nobody else got, the other speakers, a 3-minute ovation because he called for the brotherhood of religions. So you must say, what's so great about that? So many people. But more than that, he said there is no place in America and the rest of the world for bigotry, for sectarianism, and for fundamentalism. The man was, some of you know the name very well, Vivek, very easily known. And the year 1896, 100 years ago, this gentleman mentioned what now people are again saying. The last 3 weeks, for example, you take in Singapore the World Council of Churches, as tame an organization as you can get. Tame, self-censoring. They came out, they came very boldly, and they said what our friend, the pastor, Terry Jones, what Terry Jones was saying was hurtful to the Muslims everywhere. The word he used was everywhere. In a Singapore context, everywhere means Singapore. So they hurtful everywhere. And they said on top of that, but he went one step further and he said, we hope that the people of Singapore would not be bothered, would not react to something that was happening elsewhere. What struck me was this. no mention was made of the fact that this good reverend had only 50 people in his congregation. It did not factor. Likewise, the fact is that it was not going to happen in Bukit Timah or in Thompson Grove. It was going to happen in faraway Florida. That did not factor either. What that really means is that for places like Singapore, race and religion matter. That it is so fragile that any incident, even as far away as Florida, can affect us. But not when, I'm not just saying Singapore, Southeast Asia. The Prime Minister of Malaysia, you had him, then you had the President of Indonesia. They all came up and they all said, listen, this won't do. Now, so if you are in Southeast Asia, and 9/11 is not the greatest thing that, or that is not something we are preoccupied with every morning. So, but what strikes you is very simply that these people are not handling it. And why? Now I want to read to you something which one of the good friend wrote. This is what he said. The frightening events of 9/11 distorted the views and emotions of large numbers of American public and the American electorate about Islam. Many, perhaps far too many, identified 9/11 attackers with Islam and demonized Islam itself. One result of this, and this is the part I want to say, one result of this is that America's hundreds of thousands of peaceful Muslims now live in fear of their fellow Americans, who in turn have come to fear them. This continuous weakness of America cannot be in the interest of the people of Southeast Asia. I agree totally. The reason why your Council of Churches, tame, usually quiet, came out, the reason why President of Indonesia had to come out, the reason why the Prime Minister of Mahathir had to come out, or Prime Minister of Malaysia had to come out, Mahathir still remember me. But simply this, that it is the fragility of this place. That's the first thing. But the second thing is the more important thing. It is very simply that, look, whether we like it or not, even if it happens there, we are going to be affected. And what are they doing? They're not doing anything about it. Or that's what you think. Now, sitting in this room, we understand the American system. We understand that, look, this man has a way. This is how it works in that country. But what about the 2 million, 20 million, 30 million in Indonesia? What about the millions in Malaysia? Forget Singapore. What about those people? What are they thinking? What they're thinking is this. They're thinking, how come the Americans can come and preach to us, tell us about this, that, human rights, democracy, what have you, and how come they are not able to, they are willing to allow Terry Thomas trample my human rights? This is very difficult to explain. We can understand intellectually, no problem. But intellectuals don't run governments. This one, no need to go. Mary, don't write this one down. The people who create rights are not intellectuals. Let me rephrase that. So you will find that it's okay. Now I want to explain another. Let me go quickly. Okay. The next aspect of it is this. Very simply, that America, we have been noticing, the American we are seeing the last few months, maybe even a couple of years, is not the America we are accustomed to in Southeast Asia. And to understand this, it may be very quickly, we have 2-3 minutes, I'll go back quickly to Vietnam War. Now if you go to the Vietnam War, now you had America in Vietnam. The war quickly engulfed and became an Indo-Chinese war. But you had the 5 old ASEAN countries, you had Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines. They were safe from that war. They were allowed to continue. They were people who were interested and did actually development work. Their economy moved, they did well. 5 of these countries. But with the Vietnam War, this was the America they knew, by the way. Yeah? That's why when I say accustomed, this was an America which was preeminent, there was no doubt about it. This was an America which had good relations, alliances with Japan, with South Korea, which had good understanding, security understanding with Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, or no, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, and not so well known, but real relations with Malaysia and Indonesia. This was the US they knew. But when the war was ending, it became clear the Americans are going to move. It became clear that the American public was scared of this war. So the countries in Southeast Asia, what really bothered them was how can we be sure that the US will stay? It was a question of trying to ensure that the Americans would remain. Then came the Soviet breakup or decline of the Soviet Union. With that, there was really no reason for the Americans to be in this part of the world. But we it's like the My Fair Lady, the song, I've grown accustomed to her face. We had grown accustomed to the Americans. They were good. They helped us. We could continue and we wanted them. So the question was, how do we keep them here? How do we make ASEAN relevant so that it is in their interest to stay? Not because we wanted them to stay, but that was in their interest to stay. 9/11 did that. And it's sad to say this, but that's what 9/11 actually did. What happened was, you realize suddenly, hey man, some of these boys were sitting in Kuala Lumpur drinking teh tarik and planning the attack. So suddenly, radical groups in Malaysia, radical groups in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, became a matter of interest. The Americans decided, look, their own foreign policy was shifting. It was now a question of, look, what is the most important thing? War on terrorism. Terrorism posed the greatest threat. So there was a great change in the relationship. There was an enhancement in American relationship with Southeast Asian countries. They did not have military relations with Indonesia for obvious reasons, for whatever was happening there. No Indonesians here. But then they decided, look, they will start with military work or military cooperation with the Indonesians. They pumped in lots of money, but more importantly, capacity building. Singapore, Malaysia, all these countries needed that. They had a maritime security initiative where previously it was just to safeguard, now it was more than that, to ensure that the terrorist groups and weapons were not passing through. Many things happened, and many things continue to happen. And if Ustaz can say that there is great success in rehabilitation, much of the success, we have to admit, was because the Americans were there to give that help. So I will quickly end up, 2 more minutes. You notice it's always 2 more minutes. with a slight, to refer to 2 countries I'm familiar with, South Africa and Cambodia. In South Africa, you saw something, I mean, we will not compare to 9/11, but you saw something terrible, the dehumanization of our people. 30 million blacks, totally dehumanized. And yet, they have been able to put it behind them after their Truth and Reconciliation Commission with our friend Archbishop Desmond Tutu. A lot of tears, a lot of fear, but it is finished. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge got rid of, Michael there will know, some 2 odd million people. Today, the trials, the tribunals are going on. It is being put behind them. So you ask yourself, What is this greatest power on earth? Why are they not able to put it behind them? What about next year? We should have one. It will be the anniversary, 10th anniversary. Usually people do fireworks and things like that. So, can we expect fireworks for the 10th? Can we do that question?
Thank you very much. We will open the floor for comments and questions. If you would please identify yourself for those of us that might not know you, and then direct your question if you wish to one of the panels. Yes, about my thoughts.
Thank you. I have not a question, a comment. I think there are a number of issues which we have not really addressed. I don't mean here, but in the last 9 years. First of all, and I think these are some of the issues which which suggest that the idea of winning hearts and minds, as it were, has not been very successful. One issue is the whole question surrounding alternative perspectives on what happened in 9/11. And I'm speaking mainly about the Singapore context. That generally, I think there's been a failure in public discourse to address the question of alternative perspectives on what happened, alternative to the official US government version. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theory, I'm talking about credible opinions expressed by scholars and academics, of which there are many in the US, but these discussions generally are not taking place in our media, not in universities and so on. So that's one point. The other point is that while I think there are, as Professor Hudson has rightly pointed out, there's been a rise in negative opinions about Islam. At the same time, as I think Ambassador Varghese suggested, there's been also a step up in interreligious dialogue. So that has been, I think, a positive aspect of unanticipated consequence of what happened in 9/11. But at the same time, I think this is again a failure of the discourse in Singapore to address the fact that Muslim extremism doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of Jewish extremism and Christian fundamentalism, particularly Christian Zionism. And we have been woefully backward in Singapore in addressing Jewish extremism and Christian fundamentalism. Even though Christian fundamentalism is a problem, not only to the extent that it impacts on US foreign policy, but in Singapore itself. It is a problem and it is seen as a growing problem. But we only focus on Muslim extremism. So how can you expect to win the hearts and minds of Muslims when you are not addressing the proverbial other hand that claps? And this is also partly a fault of the interreligious dialogue. I think has not got to the level of discussing common fundamentalisms, common extremisms. So all the focus is on Muslim fundamentalism. My last point, and many other points actually, but I don't have to take much time. My last point is that I think it's very fashionable for us to say that Islam is not the problem, Islam is a religion of peace, and that we should know that 9/11 does not reflect on Islam itself. But let us also be a bit critical and realize that the reason why people are quick to point the finger at Islam is because Muslims themselves are to blame to a great extent. The same Muslims who would denounce terrorism and denounce violence are also people who throw the term kafir around, brand non-Muslims as kafir. They are the same people who would not criticize strains of extremism that are not violence oriented. They're the same people who would not say that stoning to death for adultery is wrong, because they firmly believe this is part of Sharia, and they do not want to criticize these efforts. They are, so you see, there are problems. Although, in other words, there's a distinction between terrorism, which is a problem, that has to be distinguished from extremism, which is also a problem, which may not be terrorist-oriented. But it is a problem, and we are not addressing it in this country. And since in the last 9 years, I think the opportunity, not been missed, but I think not been taken advantage of. We have not been taking advantage of the opportunity, partly because, and I will end here, there is a reluctance to talk about Muslim extremism. We are all ready to criticize terrorism. Everybody's on board against it. But the Muslim community, as well as the non-Muslim community, including the authorities, are reluctant to talk about Muslim extremism. For example, there is a great reluctance to talk about Wahhabism, partly because of the sensitive nature of our relations with Saudi Arabia. So I think as long as we don't talk about the greater problem, which is extremism, we are not going to take full advantage of the intellectual space that has been created after 9/11 to address some of our long-term problems.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I shall take maybe only about a minute. In the actual question, I'll take about 15 seconds to introduce myself. I am a regular foreign attendee, at least in MEI. Thanks, Ambassador. I'm a retiree who takes a very keen interest in the welfare of my country. Oh, by the way, my name is David Na. I must thank Ambassador Burgess for the gem of a couple of statements, though he slipped on the first one about the governments are not run by intellectuals. Oh boy!
That was meant to be so.
But the second statement is a gem, a nugget worth its weight in gold. Yeah? People who riot are not necessarily always intellectual. And all of us will know this fact and truth. People who are not intellectuals generally have a distrust of intellectuals, meaning they want to hear things for themselves. They may nod their head when the intellectuals, especially those in power, will say something, especially they have the power to make lives miserable for them, but they are not necessarily convinced unless and until they hear it for themselves and they come to a conclusion. Raw information, they do the processing. Not some processed information filtered down from somewhere else. Therefore, Professor Alatas also brought up some gems of a statement, and I meant no malice down here. There is this strange and very unwise policy of not encouraging Muslims to contend among themselves as to what is the truth. Yeah. So now, Ambassador asked, why couldn't the Americans put things behind, 9/11 behind, just as they put Vietnam War behind, World War II behind? They got along famously with Japan. After Japan really whacked the hell out of them in the initial years of it. Massive, what I call casualties. Why? A sideshow, very quick. Would Cordoba House, proposed Cordoba House in Ground Zero, be less of an issue if he had taken another name other than Cordoba? For those of us who know what Cordoba stands for, it stands for the Cordoba Mosque in Spain, which is built on a Christian cathedral that was demolished after the conquest of Islam in Spain. I ask this question again. Why the insistence of the name Cordoba. I'm not going to discuss all that, I'm going to move on. So I'm just going to make a closing statement. My closing statement is this, and I urge every one of us, don't necessarily comment here, but go back and reflect. There can be no end to this dispute between all this war and terrorism. War or terrorism will not end unless and until, it takes me about 15 seconds, the non-Muslim world is at ease with the whichever Islam that the Muslims themselves are comfortable with, and that the non-Muslim world is comfortable with that Islam, which the Muslim world themselves must sort it out as to which Islam is comfortable amongst Muslims. And the non-Muslim world must be comfortable with that. And the only way that can be done, and emphasize only, block, stablo, the only way that can be done is where the masses, non-Muslims and the Muslims, the masses hear it from themselves and see for themselves the arriving of the process of arriving, which is the Islam non-Muslims have to be will be comfortable with, and the Muslims themselves are comfortable with. And that can only come from a World Cup series. What I mean by World Cup series is all the contending parties will have their fair share and go at each other, go down from preliminary rounds, quarterfinals, semi-finals, 4 teams, finals, 2 teams. Quarterfinals, 2 teams from the Islamic world and 2 teams from the non-Islamic world, which they are feeling comfortable about, and then you can debate it out. Yeah, so this is my statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm an engineer, so I come from a more practical point of view than high ideals. In fact, I was asked by a veteran from Afghanistan and Iraq. He is an American commander, army commander. He asked me why military means was used first. After fighting the war, he asked me. So I gave him an answer, and that answer was in the paper called Iraq is Not None, which was presented to Senator Lugar before he briefed General Petraeus. And that was said to be the way it was done. Basically, it's this. Crashes of civilization is fundamentally wrong. Because for crashes to happen, you need to share common ground. Africans and Eskimo cannot fight. But those from Abrahamic linkage, because they share the same heritage, wherever they go, they meet each other. So it is the wise who can rally each other and progress. It is the fool that pick, divide among the unified. Pick for blood from the hill, and therefore you have war forever. So the first thing for the world to recognize is that differences is not the cause of conflict. Differences is the source of progress. Yes? And therefore, we have to share this message with other people and bring each other to progress. Each religion comes not from vanity. Each religion has their social issues to address, and therefore they have different practices. We have to recognize that and understand why it practices that way, rather than trying to say you are with me or you are against me, because that is fundamentally flawed, right? So it is not just that Islam was threatened post September 11. I coach a student at MIT. He has to hide inside the lab because he is a Chinese. He feels threatened by the Americans. You see, when conflict picks up, everyone are affected. Whether you are Islam, you are not. You are Chinese, you are Buddhist, you are Christians. All of you are affected. So I think it is important for us to recognize that understanding the only constant is change is people. The only constant change for civilization is to integrate greater number of people from greater diversity, deeper, broader, faster, more frequently. we share, we have differences, we appreciate each other, we learn from each other, we rally each other's strength, then we can progress. We cannot tell Islam, the Muslim, hey, you withdraw and I come. Or you take my value, or you appreciate my value. That will not work. We have to understand why they practice it that way. Why they do some extreme issues. Because, you know, they take certain very severe issues against certain behavior. I think we have to understand that. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just to congratulate, of course, all the speakers, which gang of four, group of four, whatever you call it, individual erudite presentations. My name is Iftikhar Chaudhary. I'm a researcher from Institute of South Asian Affairs. But in my previous avatar, I used to be a diplomat for my country, and also I sat in the cabinet of my country. One of the things we learned in the public policy stream is that just because there is a problem does not also mean there is a solution. The challenge is to contain and channel the problem in a way to avoid as many negative consequences as possible. I come from a country, Bangladesh, which is a preponderantly Muslim country. But you'll have noticed that conflict has been somewhat marginalized in that society through for a variety of reasons. One of the things that we push for is what we call ijtihad rather than jihad, which is reasoned struggle. A problem of the Islamic intellectual evolution has been the fact, for whatever reasons, experiences such as the Renaissance or the Reformation or the Industrial Revolution was denied to the Muslim world for whatever reasons, partly colonialism, partly the Crusades. As a matter of fact, the original conflict, debate between modernity and traditionalism was taking place at the time of the first Crusades when Ghazali intervened in favor of fundamentalism. We saw in many ways a repetition of the thing through the Middle Ages and also right now. The challenges of Iraq and Afghanistan creates tremendous pressures on our societies. In a society where we think we have been able to empower women, alleviate poverty, marginalize extremist thought and action, we today face these tremendous pressures coming from these international situations. A second point is that sometimes, and this is another lesson that we got from our public policy experience, is that in actual diplomacy or international relations, these issues are mixed up with practical political issues. Afghanistan, for instance, we didn't mention Pakistan too much, but Pakistan, of course, is deeply involved in Afghanistan. Not just to fight terrorism, though also that, but to create what they call the strategic depth, because Pakistan feels an existential threat from India. So this is mixed up with the global, broad regional politics of the subcontinent. You mentioned Iran and Iraq. And then, of course, what we call the core problem of the Middle East, which is Palestine. So eventually what will happen is that, I mean, I'm not being pessimistic, actually I'm being optimistic in a way, that problems will morph into different problems. The challenge would be for us now, 10 years down the line from that event, 9/11, or at various points in time as we evolve, is to channel these developments in a way that people do not unnecessarily get into conflictual situation and somehow what the English call we muddle through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I'm Diane Jacob. I says I teach at the University of Sri Lanka in my earlier incarnation as a Sri Lankan ambassador. We were in Geneva. Three quick comments and a question to the panel. The comments, taking up from what Dr. Chowdhury was saying. I think when we look back at the history of the 20th century and modernity, the present clash sheds some light on it. The WikiLeaks documentation proves what scholars in the field already knew, that Osama bin Laden had been reached out to by the United States under the Carter presidency on Brzezinski's watch 6 months before the Soviet army came into Afghanistan. So, in the struggle of modernities between the United States and the Soviet Union, the the Soviets, in a way, were representing the same sort of thing that the United States is trying to do in Afghanistan today, educating women, blah, 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 blah. And in that contestation were unleashed the forces of what are now called Islamist fundamentalism, instrumentalized just when the US now turned against the US. So it's a different light that is shed. The second point is that it looks to me like a catch-22. Anti-Islamism in the West is reinforced by images or stories such as the stoning of women and so on and so forth. But those societies or those governments or states cannot move away from this hard line because of pressure from the street, whether it's their own street or the Arab or Islamic street in general. And these reinforce each other. I just don't see how without an internal reformation, how it is possible to escape that particular catch-22. The third and final point is that Afghanistan also appears catch-22 if the United States continues to stay in, it will bleed. It will die of a death of 1,000 cuts, but it will bleed from a death of 1,000 cuts. And if it proves out, the Islamist forces will be emboldened by the thought that they managed to do to the United States what they did to the former Soviet Union. So these are three comments are made. The question is this, Iran. If the United States moves against Iran militarily, or Israel moves against Iran with a northern wing from the United States, then is that not a game changer? Isn't it going to exponentially proliferate the kind of conflicts that we've been talking about, irrespective of Sunni, Shia, or even other internal sectarian differences? That is the question that I want to pose to all four members of this excellent panel. Thank you very much for this afternoon's presentation.
Thank you very much. My answer to that would be yes. I think that's exactly what will happen. And it may happen. That we will see an explosion of hostility that will erase a lot of the intramural tensions within the world of Islam and the countries there. And maybe others would like to comment on that. Yes, please.
I'm Saad Talib. I was a member of parliament in Yemen, and I also worked in government as an anti-corruption commissioner. Now, I'll just give you a perspective of someone who has lived. I was in Yemen when 9/11 happened, and I just want to translate the feelings of the intellectuals there about all that's happening. Isn't that important? I mean, I'm talking about opinion formers, journalists, members of parliament, people in government. And we all know first that the Bin Laden thing, or Al-Qaeda, started much before, as pointed out, before September 11. And we note, I remember two very important events that the Americans were targeted. One was in Nairobi, and one was in Aden, in the year 2000, actually.
Goldmore Hotel.
Cold. Sorry. Okay. I even remember that one of the Rambo movies was about jihad in Afghanistan and how it was supported fully and backed by the United States. I can't forget that. It's just that I remember again as someone very interested in reform and good governance, that one of the first statements of President Bush after September 11th is that we must reform the Middle East and we must reform the Islamic world. Suddenly, that element has disappeared. Again, Obama has said that in Cairo, but has never acted upon it. I say this because we suffer a lot in Yemen because of governance and poverty. And and the support, the very, very frustrating support of the United States government to such corruption and such autocracy is tremendously affecting the psyche and the position of the intellectual people in most of the Islamic world. Why do you support someone who is taking away the wealth of the nation, giving it to his sons, and then want to implant his son as a successor to him after he's finished? And I'm talking about not one example, but several examples. Now that frustration, of course, against the backdrop of the very long standing, every time we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian case, we say, oh, that's a long story. Well, how long will it be? You know, first you get, the thing is, you get first some encouraging statements, and then suddenly those disappear, dissolve in air. Once you bring that element of thought into the mind of intellectual or semi-intellectual Arabs or Muslims or Afghanis or Pakistanis, it becomes a very strong argument that something is wrong, at least. And that the natural process change, as you have done in the US, you didn't like Bush, you changed him, because Obama, as has happened in the UK, as has happened in many, many places, even Israel, as has happened in America, that it is easy to change your destiny simply by talking on television and making lectures. It is not so easy in Yemen. It's not so easy in Egypt. And it is not easy because it's very easy for whoever I want to criticize in my government to point a finger at me, that man is supporting Al-Qaeda. And the next thing I know, I'm under the eyes of the world, you know, that although I have nothing to do with it. I'm happy, I'll be very happy if I keep my prayers, you know, as a Muslim. But it is so easy. Is there an element here that Muslim intellectuals, ones who are looking for change, whether in the Middle East or whether it's in Africa, or whether it is in Indonesia, whether it is in Pakistan, to get a chance at that? And instead of a war on terrorism that rebreeds, I think, terrorists, there should be a war on injustice and bad governance. The areas that are safe today are only safe because of good governance in them. And I think a lot of energy is wasted if no energy is directed towards such improvement of government and service delivery to people in many places. Thank you very much.
Was it your impression that the opinion makers in Yemen just after 9/11, their attitude was basically, well, they had it coming to them, the Americans?
Oh, absolutely. I think not that they had, that nobody imagined the scale of the thing. Nobody would have imagined. But I'll tell you that the Nairobi thing was quite big. The Beirut bombings were quite big. But because it happened outside the soil of the United States, the shock wasn't that big. But here I'm talking about, we are always discussing the psychology and the psyche of the Americans or the West or we should also, I think, a very important step is to understand the psyche of the people. It is such hard work, as my friend about rehabilitation will know, to rehabilitate 10 extremists, okay? But one unmanned missile into a village in Yemen that killed 50 people, I'll tell you, will create 1,000. 1,000 extremists. That, because, why did that happen? Why did a missile suddenly land on a village and killed at least 36 for women and children? And then nobody knew who did it, who did it? Oh, the Yemen government, oh, we did it. So we are attacking Al-Qaeda elements there. There were no Al-Qaeda elements. I'll tell you, just to lighten up a bit, I saw the pictures of those dead children, and that months later, that area was famous for some monkeys roaming about. Those monkeys came into that village because there was abandoned, too many explosives on the ground, and explosive blew up the monkeys. And 20 over monkeys were killed. Months after that cluster bomb was put on there. Now, and then the thing is, nobody, yeah. Okay, let's be sad about the monkeys. The other, the thing is, nobody comes clean. Why was that done? And then the government went to the tribes and said, okay, we will settle this. What do you want, you know? How many million? And of course, there was a parliamentary committee that was formed, and there was a parliamentary report on this. I mean, just, I think you know what I'm trying to impress here, which is the values that should be behind this war of terror should be upheld. Thank you very much.
We'll take, I think we're at time. Let's take one more time.
I don't have a comment, I have a question for I think about 150 years ago, the Tocqueville went to America to find out what's this democracy is all about. And he found it not in the Congress, he didn't find it in the village, he found it in the church. And he said, America is great because it's good. But when America ceases to be good,
Really putting me on the spot. I think, you know, the Americans have, we haven't sort of ingrained in our historical memory a notion that we were put on, you know, North American continent to be better than those battle, you know, colonialists, imperialists in Europe that were fighting each other and so forth, aristocrats and class system and all that. Equality, grassroots organization. This is what de Tocqueville, of course, you know, among the many things he discovered. Yes, churches, associations, and so forth, where the people would you know, things would sort of sort themselves out. And I think, you know, if one holds to this liberal idea, you know, you hope that eventually, in the long run, it works out that way. But as we have looked at the, you know, the recent fluctuations and sort of, I should say, aberrations in American public opinion, you know, it's hard to be great when, you know, you can't always, or you don't always do the good thing. And we are, I think, now, you know, stuck with a public opinion at this moment is rather distressed, volatile, there are all kinds of problems, and we are oddly vulnerable to the power of lunatics or extremists to have a media platform, because our media, you know, is kind of ubiquitous. So this little, you know, this insignificant character down in Florida, suddenly, you know, he's at the center of the attention, and it's a huge problem. So that I have to say, as an American, this is depressing. The political system, in so many ways, does not seem to be able to put down or to marginalize lunatic opinions, and the polarity in American politics on a lot of issues today, domestic issues, but is also easily, obviously echoed in this bitter dispute that's going on in New York and other places. And in some ways, I think that, you know, domestic discontents are transferred foreign kind of issues. I don't know, ladies and gentlemen, whether we have got any kind of a consensus here about whether after 9 years the problem's being solved or not. I sense a good bit of pessimism, but if I would actually turn to Said Mohammed, because he studies Al-Qaeda, and ask one last sort of counterfactual question. If Osama bin Laden were among us here today, and we were to ask him, how are you doing 9 years later? What do you think he would say?
First and foremost, it doesn't matter too much to us today. That's the question, because the impact to us has been felt. But if he's still around, the thing is, the first time will he be wanting to stay in such a room with us? The question that we would like to ask. So I think to him, in a way, he has excelled. He believes that he has succeeded in building a generation of his understanding of what a Muslim should be. That nobody else has done that within the context of our contemporary time.
I think he's feeling mabsut, right? Things are going his way. I mean, it's a serious question. I think because I think there are plenty of people who think he's on the ropes. That Al-Qaeda, is it a cult? And if it is, cults don't always have a long shelf life. But that, I think, is the issue. Are we out of the woods on this or not? And my sense is that there are more pessimists than optimists among us. So, yes, Terry.
Could I just quickly try to answer your question? I think Osama bin Laden would say that he would not be happy. See, I think he would be happy if we assume that he's an irrational man. And Al-Qaeda are just a bunch of irrational people who just want to create conflict, meaningless conflict. But I think that's a very false assumption. I think they are very rational people with very definite goals, which is not to justify what they're doing. And I think what they wanted to see is a united Muslim movement against what they understand as Western imperialism, against the US and so on. And I think they will be disappointed that they have not seen that.
Okay, one last
Out of that, I think it's too early to tell, because it depends on whether President Obama winds up another JFK. I don't necessarily mean fatally. What I mean is, Professor Hudson showed us the national proliferation of the national security apparatus. Reminds me of President Eisenhower's closing remarks about the military industrial complex. And John F. Kennedy found himself having to move on Cuba and certainly going to Vietnam, also to defend his political flank against thunder on the right. Now, will President Obama, after the November congressional elections, feel so embattled that he would go down the same road and enter some sort of nuclear venture we talked about Iran? If so, perhaps I think Osama can be happy where he is. But if that can be, if things can be stopped short of that, so long as Obama remains and stays the course, I think he will lost out.
Well, that's an interesting point. Our elections take place in November, and before every election, somebody talks about an October surprise. That the embattled incumbent will do something really spectacular just to kind of mobilize people behind him. Obama is facing a tough re-election campaign, but the risks, as I think was pointed out here, of such an adventure are manifest, and one never knows. But I would be highly surprised if there was an October surprise. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We have some tea and cookies, I think, out there.